looking across the globe. I won't say any jokes. I'll just keep it
You can say
simple.
whatever you
No,
like.
I'm not.
It's really nice to see this room full of academic family, I would say. Lots of familiar faces. Really brings a smile on my face, especially because I'm introducing a very special guest tonight, Professor Martinon Torres, the previous professor of archaeological science at the University of Cambridge, who spent more than a decade, I think, at UCL. And I was honored to meet him just as he started, as I started my master's. So he's been a huge inspiration for my own work and for many of us who are actually present here. I see a lot of Marcus' students, and it just speaks of how much he is appreciated as a scholar, but also as a colleague and a friend. I don't know where to start with like how amazing his career has been and continues to be. He is in charge of the Cherish Hub, which is the Cambridge Heritage Science initiative. He's been gathering different kinds of research funding and research initiatives amounting to amazing £12 million. That's quite a money to assemble for research. Many of his projects are very well known globally. If you have seen on the left-hand side as you enter the Terracotta Warrior, that is because Marcus was working with the Shia Museum. We see other people who work in the museum present here, but it's one of those hallmark projects that he had here. Also participating in another multi-million project with Cyprus on training archaeomaterial scientists, and his own ESC Advanced Grant on reverse action, looking at complex technologies in stateless societies. So it's always on the edge and always inventing and innovating in research and setting the stage for us actually to come and follow. And what an act to follow. So thank you very much, Marcus. We are here because we are organizing this annual lecture, Beno Rothenberg, as part of the activities of the Institute for Archaeometallurgical Studies, of which Marcus is also a trustee. Beno Rothenberg is a famous name amongst archaeometallurgists. He invented the term archaeometallurgy, and I have heard that Marcus had the honor to meet him and learn about all the stories of how impossible it was to work in Spain, because Spaniards are known to just take siestas all the time and lazy and not really do the work. So Marcus kind of, Marcus proved wrong. It's one of those stories you just have to listen over and over again, I've been told, when you have such prominent people in the room and retelling you them like for 10 years or so. So honoring Beno Rothenberg, also honoring the tradition of archaeometallurgy and excellent archaeological science research that comes out of this institution, I'm very, very pleased and honored to have Marcus Martinon Torres delivering the lecture on gold and power to the people. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Miliana, for such a warm introduction, and thank you all for having me and for being here today. It's always really nice to come to back to the Institute, which is the place that made me professionally, but also largely personally, for what it's worth, where I made loads of friends, which I'm very honored to still have, and some of them in this room. Though on a sad note, of course, I should mention that today we buried one of them, George Davies, whom many of you here knew. And so I would also like to take a moment to remember him. Now, the Institute of Archaeology in general, and YAMS, the Institute for Archaeometallurgical Studies in particular, has been very meaningful to me, enabling me as an archaeometallurgist to discover that archaeometallurgy could be a job, but also in providing free training to countless students from around the world. And with that, really life-changing opportunities to many people who are now employed in various institutions in multiple countries. And I think that has to be noted and appreciated as well, not least as now education is largely regarded as a luxury in many quarters. And it is of luxury that I'm going to be talking to you about today. and particularly the ultimate luxurious material. If I can change slide, maybe with this. Gold is, of course, the ultimate luxurious materials, nowadays considered universally as the marker of value and prestige and power and whatnot. And it may be worth reflecting briefly on some of the universal material properties of gold that make it so special. As I'm sure many of you will know, gold is the only element that is golden, that has this color in its pure state, unalloyed. It also, because of its nobility, remains golden. It doesn't tarnish easily at all. And then another element that is very important to understand the peculiarities of gold is its rarity. You can see some calculations there. If we estimate the amount of gold that has been extracted from the Earth's crust from the beginning of humankind, and then we were to distribute that evenly across the world's population, we would all be entitled to about 23 grams of gold. So if you have more than 23 grams of gold, you should consider whether you have the gold that might belong to somebody else. In any case, for these and other reasons, gold has nowadays universally, and in the past in a more patchy way, but has been used predominantly for two things. One is as a way of materializing and storing and exchanging wealth, and the other one as a way of highlighting individual status, prestige, or power. So in the present, we see that materialized in gold ingots, but in the past, we have plenty of gold coin hoards that we tend to interpret pretty much in the same way, as a form of storing wealth. And similarly, broadly, when not using wealth, or relatedly, perhaps, gold is used as a marker of power, status, identity. And that applies broadly to Tutankhamun's gold mask, as it does to the other individual there who paid $250,000 to have a golden shirt, surely to in some way mark his individuality and his difference from others. And this applies to gold, but generally to other luxurious materials, be them precious stones, special textiles, amber, emeralds, and whatnot, that we see in the present, but also in the past. And we tend to immediately associate to a variety of concepts, implicitly or explicitly. We associate luxury to wealth, power, status, complexity, the exotism of often long-distance trade, etc., etc. And in the, well, I was going to say recent years, but possibly more longer than recent years, I've had the opportunity to work with luxurious materials in general, with gold in particular, in a range of archaeological sites around the world. And in so doing, I've begun to unpick or unpack that concept of luxury. In sociology and in anthropology, luxury, but also in common lay terms, really, we explicitly or implicitly define luxury as a combination of two parameters. On the one hand, there is the consumption side of luxury that emphasizes the idea of luxury as something that separates the haves and the have-nots because it's desirable, access is restricted to elites, and so on. From the production side of things, luxury we tend to define as something that materializes the investment of exceptional resources in terms of skill and labor and or the materials themselves to produce objects that are typically not geared towards subsistence. So there's a production and there's a consumption side to luxury. And what I have been trying to do is play with the possibility of exploring luxury, but without making any assumptions about the consumption side of things. So we study luxury as materials in the present as in the past that materialize a high investment of labor, skills, knowledge, apprenticeship, materials, etc., to produce objects that are not geared towards solving utilitarian practical problems, but without making any a priori assumptions about the value, the social value, the use and the consumption of those luxurious artifacts. And if we forget about that, or if we suspend, if you like, those assumptions about consumption, it is then possible to ask the question, can luxury be shared? The answer to that, if you ask me, and I hope to substantiate that today, is a resounding yes. Luxury can be shared. And the question that follows, therefore, is how can it be shared? How can we create systems where you don't have individuals attracting that luxury, as individual markers, how can you, or coercing others to produce luxurious materials for them, how can we still sustain luxury technologies that are shared? Briefly, the answer to that would have to be collective action. I don't have much time to elaborate on the concept of collective action here, but it is basically a rather broad term that is used in archaeology and in anthropology, etc., to emphasize explanations for social structures that prioritize the horizontal rather than the vertical, communities that are self-organized without a top-down organization, that they self-regulate, typically voluntarily, and to obtain communal benefit. This is something, among many scholars in the history of collective action, I need to highlight Professor Elinor Ostrom, who was the first female to win the Nobel Prize of Economics. I think I'm right when I say this, and who very convincingly exposed that the tyranny of the commons was a fallacy. Namely, the idea that if you have resources managed communally and for communal benefit, they are inevitably going to be overexploited and unsustainable. She demonstrated historically and ethnographically that this was not the case, and that you can successfully sustain communal resources for centuries. And so this is something that archaeologists, of course, knew about even before Professor Ostrom, not least in major irrigation works that we find in various continents. And this is an example from Colombia, where I work, where in the Mompox Depression, you have as much as 100,000 kilometers of irrigation channels that were produced in the absence of any coercive political authorities, as far as we know. So through cooperation and collective action, and for communal benefit to manage the water, avoid flooding, agriculture, fishing, etc. So this is something that we know archaeologically, but what we have had less is studies of the products of collective action, community action, and sharing, and so on, in the area of luxury materials, things that are not geared towards subsistence, or indeed to the construction of monumental burial mounds, which would be the other dimension where we see often collective action. And this really is what the Reverse Action project that Miliana was mentioning is about. We are focusing on how complex technologies, but particularly the useless, luxurious ones, worked in societies without state authorities, without capitalist market forces, where we don't have any evidence of people with the power to coerce others or to extract wealth and labor from others. And so we are looking at different world regions and focusing on the production of textiles that are particularly elaborate, semi-precious or precious stones, very ornate ceramics, and of course gold as the ultimate luxurious material that I'll be focusing on today. And I would like to present to you a couple of studies of areas that we're working on. One a bit more brief, and the other one a bit more elaborate, to try and show, illustrate, and substantiate some of the claims that I've been trying to make. The first one comes from Crete, where I have been working with Borja Legarra here at UCL, as well as others. And I think it's a pertinent case study because, of course, you will know the Minoan civilization as, often quoted in history books as the cradle of European civilization, because it is here where we see the emergence of the first states that we tend to associate, of course, to civilization. But what Borja and I started doing was focusing on the earliest uses of gold. And I'm illustrating that with Mochlos, but the same applies to any other site for this period. So in the early to middle Bronze Age, the earliest use of gold around 2000 BC, if we make no assumptions about the implications of the use of gold, and if we for a second forget the end of the story, which is eventually we will have states, how can we interpret the material evidence for gold? Now, traditionally, people would see gold as early indicators of individual prestige, people progressively accumulating gold and the prestige associated to that, and progressively coalescing in power and wealth, concentrating in few hands, and the familiar story. But if we look at the earliest phases, what we find is, first of all, that gold appears in communal tombs, so not associated to any particular individual, as far as we can determine. And also, and notably, that we find gold in practically every tomb that's excavated. So it's not concentrated in individual tombs. Different amounts of gold, you also have tombs of different sizes, but gold appears to be quite widespread. And the gold that we find is typically sheet hammered gold, because there's no gold occurring geologically on Crete. All of it had to be imported, and by hammering it very thinly, taking advantage of the malleability of gold, they had a lot of surface relative to volume, basically. And a lot of these gold had to be stitched or sewn into fabrics, really, to be worn. But what I would like to highlight is first, the technological diversity that we see in these relatively simple, they are relatively simple objects, mostly just hammered, cut, and embossed, but we find some technological variability. Here, for example, in the frequent embossed decorative dots, same technique, but on the left, you see a sharper tool with an angular section, whereas on the right, you have a softer individual. So just indicating that we have different individuals working on these artifacts, sometimes the very same artifact. Perhaps a better illustration is these two chains, both of them from Mochlus, typologically the same, the loop in loop. But if you look at the one on the left, you will see, the one on the left here, you can see this longitudinal crease that is suggesting that this wire was made basically by hammering a strip of metal that had a square cross section, whereas on this one, you see helicoidal lines on the right-hand side that suggests that this cable was made by twisting. So different techniques to achieve the same purpose, and therefore indicative of different ways of doing, different people, different workshops perhaps, and also the way in which these are joined together. On the right-hand side, you see a very good high-temperature joint that is almost seamless, whereas on the left, we have a soldering lump of somebody potentially less skilled at the work. This variability in technological hands and skills, we also see in these frequent gold leaves that we find in Mochlus, as well as in other sites. For example, here in the top left, you see a leaf that's arguably very nicely cut and polished, very symmetrical, very evenly decorated, whereas next to it, you have one that has cutting errors beneath it, one where the dots are less even in their design. So again, different hands, perhaps with different skills levels, involved in the production of these artifacts. And after these artifacts are made, they are extensively used. As I said before, they often had to be stitched or sewn into other substrates, and we frequently have extensive evidence of stitching and restitching and attaching and reattaching and indeed repairing and curating multiple times, probably for more than one generation. And then, of course, these objects will end up in tombs where we find them. But before they go into tombs, and this is the most characteristic thing that we found in this early record of use of gold, is fragmentation. Almost invariably, every one of these objects has been ripped, cut, broken. Look at this diadem, for example. It would seem like a whole object, but as you see the drawing, you will notice that there is something awkward about it. The animals have been sewn off. And under the microscope, you can actually see this is not an accident. They've actually drawn and marked a line and then ripped this diadem before depositing it in the burial. In other cases, we find that the antennas have been ripped off these diadems, leaving those dents that you see, and you find either the broken diadem or the strips of metal that we can now confidently identify as the antennas that have been taken off the diadems. And we can also revisit, if we go beyond the pretty objects in museum showcases, countless tiny objects of gold that have been dismissed as scrap that you find in burials, but that actually they are microscopic. This is a 1 millimeter scale, but you can see that they're actually arguably also fragments of larger decorated objects that were ripped before placing them in tombs. So even the objects that would appear complete, such as the gold leaves, we can argue that they actually were part of larger wholes and they have been detached from them. We only have one case of this spray of leaves. In other cases, what we have is loose leaves, or indeed the stems that were taken out of a flower. And then through chemical analysis, as well as meticulously comparing their shapes, we can identify leaves that were cut out of the same template and from the same gold sheet. So they are the same batch of gold, probably made by the same person, the same production event, but that are potentially separated and they end up in different places. Where is all of that taking us? How can we summarize this? Well, arguably in these early Bronze Age Crete sites, gold arrives in relatively small batches of metal from elsewhere. It cannot be local. It is then transformed by multiple hands that are not particularly skilled on average. There are some exceptions, but it doesn't require particularly high skills, enormous training. I don't think they are specialists attached to any elites. And these objects are then extensively used and reused and sewn and resewn, etc., probably by multiple people. Before then, at some point, they are cut, ripped, fragmented, and recombined sometimes, shared, exchanged, perhaps as fragments, before eventually finding their way to collective burials, where, once again, they cannot really be associated to any one individual. Something that I would like to think, but of course cannot prove, is the possibility that these collective tombs that were used repeatedly, potentially somebody could go take a gold object or a fragment and bring it back to the world of the living and have it in circulation and use before then burying it again in a different tomb or fragmenting it again. That's of course hard to tell, but possible. And in all of these, of course, we are connecting the dead and the living. So this picture, I don't think, emphasizes, therefore, gold as a material that's separating people. It's something that we are beginning to do, but it's very early stages, is to actually see connections between tombs within a site and potentially beyond the site that are connected because they have matching fragments or parts of the same object. And so here, arguably, and there's many more of these that we still need to substantiate, but you can see the idea of certainly looking at gold in a very different way, because in these Cretan case study, we would argue, gold is prioritizing horizontal networks. It's actually connecting people, bringing people together. There are many hands involved in the making, in the sharing, in the cutting, in the wearing of gold, and these are connecting people once dead, and potentially the dead and the living, strengthening those links. And we could even take this further to argue potentially that those tombs that we would regard archaeologically as poorer, those that have potentially only a few small fragments of broken gold, potentially are the most richly connected because they have shared more gold with other tombs at the site and beyond. And so this is the first snapshot of how we can potentially read different patterns of consumption and production, indeed, of luxurious gold. But I would like now to move and perhaps spend a little bit more time in a region where I've been doing a lot more work in recent years. And it's a region that, unlike Crete, does not usually feature in those histories of civilization. Because if I ask most of you here or elsewhere really to name pre-Hispanic civilizations of the Americas, you would probably come up with Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, which are, of course, the classical civilizations because they are the classical empires of the Americas. But there's a lot of gray area there. And are we suggesting they were not civilized? There were people there. And this region where I work is typically called by archaeologists and anthropologists the intermediate area, because it's neither north nor south in between those empires. And indeed, the social structures that live there until the Europeans got there, they are intermediate societies. They are... Is that coming from the dead? No worry, it seems to have gone. So these are called intermediate societies, as seeing, of course, implying that they are forever in these intermediate stage of development, not quite becoming the civilizations, namely the states that we would expect them to become. And I think as soon as you put this in paper, you will understand why Colombians get quite crossed about this kind of terminology. So what makes these societies intermediate, less civilized? Certainly not the material record. And you just need to go into the Gold Museum in Bogota to find 35,000 gold objects, speaking very eloquently about the luxury, the technological knowledge, the artistic sensitivity, the ritual sophistication of the societies that live there. Why were they not a civilization? Why are we not talking about them? What makes them peculiar is that, as far as we can tell, there is no compelling evidence anywhere of somebody with the strong political power to extract wealth and labor from others. Obviously, I don't have the time to go into the intricacies of the mosaic of cultures that we know historically from Colombia in their different ecological systems, etc. But just to say that there's, of course, a rich diversity of indigenous communities there that are beginning to be, well, no, they have been progressively being really revealed for decades, but where archaeological work is becoming more and more intense. And for today, I'm going to concentrate on the Muisca, which is one of these, perhaps the better known or one of the better known pre-Hispanic societies that inhabited the Eastern Cordillera, the area that's broadly now around what today is Bogota, a Chibcha-speaking agricultural society. Were highly mobile, but they produced agriculture, they did farming, they extracted emeralds and salt, which they traded. And interestingly, one of the few regions of Colombia where we have no gold. So in that, they are similar to Crete. They have no gold geologically, but they have loads of gold archaeologically, as we're about to see. And so I would like to spend a moment at Nueva Esperanza. Nueva Esperanza is an extraordinary archaeological site, the largest, I think it's the largest archaeological excavation, certainly in Colombia, if not in the whole of South America in recent years. 20-hectare settlement, high in the mountains next to the Tequendama waterfalls, where there's been loads of settlement area, buildings, etc., and as well as many as 3,000 burials. We could just talk about Nueva Esperanza for the whole day, but I'm going to zoom into a particular aspect that's relevant to gold and power. Because some of the burials there, and I realize I am just generalizing chronologically, etc., because we don't have the time for nuance, though we can, of course, discuss any particular detail you may wish to talk about later. But some of the burials there are associated to gold, and they are largely body ornaments, pendants, beads, nose rings, pectorals, some of which are quite elaborate. They, of course, all of them require the import of gold into the region, but then quite a lot of investment of labor. Look at these pair of earrings here, or indeed these peculiar necklaces made of beads that we are now experimenting to understand how they were made, because they were made on stone matrices like the ones you have on the right, which were first carved, and then on those they would make wax models, out of which they would then, so they're not embossing the metal directly onto the stone, but they're actually creating lost wax casting out of those in a technique that, as I said, we are still exploring, which I'm not going to go into today, but just to emphasize, once again, there is a lot of labor and material investment. So these are luxurious materials, if you ask me. And then what one might infer from that is that, of course, those who were buried with gold might have been in some way richer, more powerful, more entitled potentially to better food. So let's talk about food through the biomolecular analysis of some of the human remains recovered there. For those of you who are less familiar with isotopic analysis of diet, but without going into a lot of detail, as you may know, you can analyze plant tissue as well as collagen and dentin from skeletons for their nitrogen and carbon isotopes, and from that make inferences about their diet. So on the diagram on the right, people who eat more protein will plot, when you analyze human remains, more towards the top, people who eat more maize, more toward the bottom right, and so on and so forth. So when you analyze humans, we eat generally a variety of plants and animals, and those animals are herbivores, etc. So it's a complex mechanism. They tend to plot in this area, where within this square, depending on what they ate. So if we now look at this square for the site of Nueva Esperanza, what we find, without going into a lot of detail, is on the right, we have herbivores, mostly because they eat plants. And to the right, we have in green the humans who eat a variety of plants and animals, of course. You can see in purple a dog with a diet similar to that of humans. But what's interesting to highlight here is if we look at those humans and their distribution and separate those that are associated to gold to those that are not associated with gold. And what you can see is that there's no real differentiation, as far as we can tell, in the diet of those associated to gold and those not associated to gold. There are a few outlying individuals towards the top that are more enriched in nitrogen-15, and those are invariably infants, people who are breastfeeding and therefore more enriched in protein, whether or not they were buried with gold. In fact, statistically, there's also no difference between males and females. So we can argue they have a diet, all of them, that's rich in protein and maize, but without obvious differentiations. Let's look at these from a slightly different perspective at a different, but also very important settlement and burial site in the same region, that of Tibanica. So here we can try to explore whether individual, well, I'll show you in a second, again, looking for indications of privilege in those associated to gold. So at Tibanica, there has been extensive osteoarchaeological work. At Nueva Esperanza, it's still ongoing because, as you know, this is slow. And it's a very recent excavation. But we can look at other ways through paleopathologies to try and find any difference between the gold people and the non-gold people, those who were buried with rich burial goods and those who were not. And one of those indicators, however blunt, is dental hypoplasia, which, as you know, may develop for stress, be it nutritional or the disease, sometimes just fear of disease. But it's interesting to compare their incidence. On the left, individuals who were, so on the left is the ones associated to gold and other luxurious materials. On the right, incidence on those who are not associated to gold. No significant difference. Similarly, we can look at the incidence of cribra orbitalia, which is this sponginess that you see inside the eye socket, typically associated to anemia or other nutritional deficiencies. And again, no statistically significant difference between the gold people and the non-gold people. The same applies to another pathology that we can see, and often again associated to deficiencies in nutrition or other health problems. Again, no difference between those associated to gold and those who were not buried with gold. So again, as far as the skeletal analysis can tell us, there's no health difference between the rich and the poor. And so having gold, what does it bring to you? Certainly not better health. Also at Tibanica, we have some initial, limited but initial results for genetic analysis. At present, we only have mitochondrial DNA, which, as I'm sure many of you will know, informs us about the maternal lineage, but we can begin to reconstruct family trees, if you like, or ancestral lines and haplotypes based on this information, and then try to see whether particular families were associated to gold. And so you can see there the individual who were buried with gold, and you can see that gold occurs across all the haplotypes, across all the ancestral lines. So there's no strong indication suggesting that gold was concentrated in particular families, if you like, which is again another interesting finding, I think. And so overall, really, yes, some people are buried with gold, others are not. And surely that must be some marker of individuality, just as others may have been buried with feathers or textiles that we simply were not recovered. But clearly, we're not claiming everyone is the same. All we are saying is that there's no evidence for that strong association between gold, privilege, and power that we tend to so easily conflate when we look at the archaeological evidence. And I would like to spend a bit more time now looking at other type of gold work also associated to the Muisca, which are typically not found in human burials, but in other locations. And these are the famous tunjos. Tunjos are relatively small, typically about this size, anthropomorphic figurines made of gold that represent individual, more or less recognizable characters. So you have there on the left a woman with a baby, next to it a warrior potentially coming back from a battle with a trophy head, and so on and so forth. And these very recognizable in terms of the style figurines or so-called tunjos typically appear as interpreted as votive offerings. So they appear in groups, often in a ceramic container, and deposited in special sacred locations, lakes, caves, prominent features of the landscape, and so on and so forth. All of these objects were made by the so-called lost wax casting technique, which some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. So all of them started life as wax models, working with wax coils and plaques to create these little figurines. Then around them, the artisan would build a mold made of charcoal, dust, and clay. Then you would melt the wax out to create a void in your clay mold, into which you can pour the metal, break the mold, and you will obtain your unique figure of whatever shape you had. There is a lot of work involved, as you can imagine, in creating these tiny figures. Don't be misled by, I'll show you some scale bars in a second. Don't be misled by the nice pictures. They are tiny. Working with these coils of wax and then making the molds around them. This is just some experimental work to highlight the many parts that need to be brought together, as well as then the feeders that will channel the metal into the various parts of these figurines. Extremely laborious work, not just in the casting of gold, but in the working with wax. But then you look at some of these in more detail, and again, almost invariably, you will find something that's quite peculiar and at first surprising. Let's look, for example, at these tiny figurines of basket men, hombres canasto. These are all three men in the basket posture, which is the posture you use to collect thoughts with your arms around your knees. You put them under a microscope, so you can see the scale bar here. So the width is 5 millimeters. But what you can see is that, you know, the peculiar way in which the wax coils have been put together. But then we find dirt in them, which are remains of the original mold built around the wax that have never been cleaned out. You also find those traces of a fracture on the top that nobody has bothered polishing or cleaning, which would be extremely easy. So you invest a lot of work in creating the wax model, then the mold around it, then you pour your metal, and then you don't bother cleaning it up properly. Clearly, that was not their expectation. They did not expect the gold to be shiny and fancy in the way we expect it today. In fact, this gold was not used for display because it was offered in a particular location. Another example is this person with a baby, where again, you can see the extremely laborious work with the wax, and you can see some SEM details. So the baby here, the lips of the baby were modeled with a coil that has 1/3 of a millimeter in diameter to work with the wax. They create the mold, they cast the metal, but then inevitably in any casting, there will be some casting flashes, some little breaks in the mold, which any artisan today or in most workshops in the world would easily and swiftly remove, but not in this case. Clearly, they are not seeing as casting errors. They are seeing as intrinsic parts of the artifact that are left with the artifact. In other cases, this is even more blatant, like this baby tied to a cot where there was a casting void on the top left that nobody has attempted to repair, or indeed the face of this individual, which again shows something that we would call a casting error, but clearly they wouldn't call a casting error. Now, how do we explain this? Of course, we explain it poorly, which is what we archaeologists tend to do, but we can make a tenuous, but I think interesting reference to the ethnographic record. So the Uva are a Chibcha-speaking community that still lives in the eastern highlands of Colombia. With all due caution, they are the closest we have to the cultural descendants of the Muisca. And among the Uva, bees, beeswax, and honey are still extremely important for ritual and symbolic purposes. They feature very prominently bees in foundational myths as a model of an organized society, and bees products are consumed in a variety of rituals to do with fertility, reproduction, and other dimensions of society. So it may be far-fetched, but certainly tempting to say that the making of these Muisca objects was as important as the finished object, and the modeling, the handling of wax was part of the offering itself, and potentially as important, if not more, than the final product in gold. And these sorts of features that we see in all of these tuncos are actually also present in the famous Muisca raft of El Dorado. This is arguably the most important heritage artifact in Colombia. The reason being, and many of you will know it as the raft of El Dorado, and this is so famous because it is well accepted to represent the ceremony of El Dorado. El Dorado was the golden one. It was a person, not a place, even though it would become identified with a place. It was a person who would embark on a raft made of reeds, sail to the middle of a sacred lake, and there make an offering of gold. And this is, of course, what sparked the European interest in El Dorado as a place, that lake that might be full of gold, and that led to countless expeditions from the 16th to the early 20th century, trying to find El Dorado with variable degrees of success. But these clearly important objects displays extraordinary labor in the creation of the wax model and then the mold around it. It's hard to see images of gold, but it's extremely detailed. These are individuals with feathers in their heads and with a jaguar mask in front of them, which we have extensively discussed in the paper if you want to read about what the iconography might mean here. But what I want to highlight is that, again, in an object as important as this, we see those features that we were identifying in other artifacts. So there is a fallen feather that nobody thought of lifting. There's mold residues stuck to the face of all the individuals in cracks and crevices. And even the feeders that were used for the metal to reach this individual were never cut off. So there's they left evidence of the different stages of manufacture. So it's totally a different, you will hopefully agree with me, a different way of understanding, valuing, and using gold to what we might expect. And I'm approaching the end. I won't hold you for much longer. Oh, I wanted to show you, before moving to the last thing, another aspect of the Muisca raft, which we often don't see. If you turn it around and look at the bottom, you can also see a blatant problem with it. That is, the wax model probably was like this, replicating a raft made of reeds. But when they cast the metal, the mold shattered, the metal spread, and that's the final result. But of course, that was not a problem for them. For them, it was a perfectly acceptable object, even if it might not be by our standards of today. But I thought I would finish with another Muisca offering case study, but one that stems from a relatively recent excavation, and also one that's interesting because it is well dated to the early years after the Europeans got there, and it is as such a very interesting materialization of the indigenous endurance and resistance of their ritual practices in the face of European contact and prosecution. And this is a site not far from Colombia, not far from Bogota, sorry, where archaeologists have excavated, I think so far, 7 different offerings of the kinds that I was describing. And in general, they're not just gold, there are different ceramic containers, there are textiles there at the bottom, there are emeralds, there are marine exotic shells. But I just thought I would very quickly illustrate with one of those several offerings, something that again brings the point home that I was trying to make. This is one of those various offerings, and as you can see, there are emeralds, there's a small gold ingot, a gold sheet, and then these various tunjos. And what's interesting about these tunjos, or what I would like to highlight now, is again the variety of hands and materials involved in their making. They are clearly not the work of a single artisan. First, just looking at what you might call their style, and again thinking that these were made with wax coils. If you look at which one goes first, the one on the left, to make the eyes and the nose, they used a single coil, whereas the one at the top, they drew first a horizontal line and then a vertical line. I mean, this is kind of silly, but it's strongly suggestive of 2 styles of drawing, what art historian connoisseurs would do. Speaking a bit more technically, if you turn them around and look at how they've been built, this is a structure that has been cast 3-dimensionally with a charcoal core, which, without going into details, in terms of its manufacture, it's radically different from the 2-dimensional flat cast tunjo. Clearly a different learning tradition, clearly a different way of doing things. And then the third one is also peculiar in that after casting, they wrapped around the hammered sheet. And these technological differences, speaking of different artisans, we see also under the microscope in other minute details of the artifacts found there. What we have on the right is 2 gavias. These are sacrificial posts, and they both have kind of pendants hanging from them. But the one on the top was a sheet of metal that was hammered, then perforated, then hung from that hoop, whereas the one at the bottom was cast directly using the lost wax technique. So again, everything and loads of other traits that obviously I don't have the time to go into are indicative of different manufacturing hands. And indeed, if we look at the chemical composition of the artifacts recovered there, we have a huge array of composition across these offerings, highly variable concentrations of gold and copper. Silver is not a metal that they had awareness of. They didn't modify silver contents, but they have highly variable alloys of copper and gold, suggestive of different alloying traditions. And hopefully in due course, we don't have that yet. The trace elements will reinforce or prove our suspicion that the gold is indeed coming from a range of geological sources, which is something we have seen at other sites as well. So they are not coming from a single source, which is what we would expect from a society that wants to be resilient. And so everything here, I would argue, suggests that, again, we have a variety of hands, materials, alloys, metal sources converging in a communal offering, an offering that's not associated to any one individual, but it is presumably done on behalf of a community and for the benefit of a community, and bringing a variety of people and resources together. And so I hope that in this tour, jumping from Crete to Colombia, I have, well, hopefully entertained you, but also prompted you to think that we can perhaps break that association between gold and power, between gold and prestige, or gold and luxury more generally, as something that is only possible in societies where individuals are benefiting from extracting the labor of others. There's other ways of producing and enjoying luxurious materials. And I always find it interesting to, to return to the Muisca raft that I was just talking about, to show these images, because when the Muisca raft was found, the Bank of Colombia thought it would be a good idea to print these very important heritage artifacts on a banknote. And I love this banknote that's no longer in circulation, of course, because it encapsulates two completely different ways of understanding and using gold. On the one hand, the banknote itself reminds us of gold as a purely economic commodity, as a marker of wealth. But printed on it, we have a Muisca raft in a world where surely gold had economic value, but also, and more importantly, ritual and symbolic value. And a community where arguably gold did not separate people, but actually brought people together. So these are two different ways of understanding gold, and it's with these two that I leave you. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Definitely recognize many people in the audience. Thank you so much again. Marcus will be taking questions while I check Zoom.
Sure.
So,
Sure. With the beads that look like fish. Yeah.
It looked like it was put together. Am I remembering that right? Do you know if it was found strung, or was the stringing done later by the New Zealand people?
Yeah, the string is modern. So
Sorry,
the string is modern. Yeah, it's a modern assembly of the beads.
Was it actually found strung together, or was it found in pieces?
It was not found strung together. It was found. That one was excavated recently, and so we know there's photographs of the location of the beads that appear to form a necklace that would resemble that, but no actual traces of the thread itself. Yeah, Louise, hi.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I was struck by your last throwaway sentence, actually, when you said there was no silver. Was at the time of this, the New raft, was there no silver? Because when I worked in Peru, we said we had silver alongside the gold.
Yes, in Colombia, there is no evidence of silver metallurgy in most of Colombia throughout history. So the silver that we have in the gold, we understand it to be naturally present in the gold. As you know, geologically, gold is always argentiferous. And it's only in the south of Colombia, in the Nariño region, in the border with Ecuador, and therefore closer to the Inca world, where we do find evidence of separate silver metallurgy as a separate metal. So we have it in Mexico, we have it in Peru, but not in Colombia.
Yes, John?
My question, why did you pick rock blocks as an example? Because it's not one that would immediately come to mind as being one of the most elite of the middle Minoan sites.
Well, we have been, I presented Moklos because it's one where we've analyzed, I think, pretty much all of the gold that was recovered there, if not, or at least almost all of it. I'm looking for Borja, and I don't know where he's sitting, but anyway, we certainly analyzed a lot of Moklos, and therefore we have a more extensive record of the gold. But we've done Sisi, we've done Agios Haralambos, we've done, what's the other one that we did at the Fitzwilliam? Anyway, all of the sites that we've looked at, they all, I mean, why is Moklos less elite? The thing is that at that time, we have communal tombs with gold, and this is pretty much the picture that we see everywhere. Basically, gold that is not spectacular in its manufacture and that is invariably broken or ripped. When it's not broken or ripped, then it's a leaf that arguably has been detached of that, or a single bead that arguably has been detached from a bigger necklace. So all of the sites that we've looked at for that period show similar evidence.
Justine, I saw.
Yes, you're showing a whole range of compositions of gold and copper. Were they very different colors? Would these have been noticed by the people? Was there any selection as to, what things were made out of which colored gold?
That's a very good question. And the Muisca, unlike other Colombian cultures, are known for having used the full range of possibilities of alloys and therefore colors and properties from very rich in copper to very rich in gold, which again strongly indicates that value is not attached to the purity of gold, it's something else. There's two things that are interesting. One is that however the purity, you always find a little bit of copper in the gold or a little bit of gold in the copper. They never use the pure metal. So clearly, if you argue, if you believe me, ritually the two metals had to be present, and then in different combinations. In the Sana in the Amazonian region, are a present-day community, speak of color energies, and some people have talked about that. So that is not just about the colors, but what the colors reflect about the composition of things and their power. And perhaps that's how we need to interpret them. So you can clearly see different colors. Sometimes the compositional differences are so subtle that you cannot tell the difference in color, but they might tell that here they're putting 3 nuggets and here they're putting 2 for whichever ritual reason. Because I think for the Muisca votive offerings, the manufacture of them is part of the ritual, and everything must have been constrained by whatever ritual presents. So it's not just the final shape, but how you make it that is part of the ritual, I would argue.
Thank you very much for that talk. What I've been really interested in learning, because I think it's very compelling evidence by it, but I'm very interested in the question of how far this gold has been removed from its point of collecting. And you mentioned the Desana, and the Desana and all of those group of indigenous communities in the Northwest Amazon, they are reported from the 16th century onwards as having earrings of gold, nose rings of gold, etc., etc. There's ethnographic evidence that they exist. I have heard people say that there's one hidden somewhere here. And the big question that I have is to what extent we should be believing that alongside that equalization of the use of gold that you are arguing for through the burials, we are also seeing a lot of long distance trade in those items, which of course renders the question of the intrinsic value of it in a slightly more complicated way. It doesn't mean that these are accumulations of wealth, but certainly that the symbolic value that is associated with them is traveled very far.
Yes, and I mean, as you know, from the Amazonian side of things, we know very little. For the Muisca, this is ongoing work that Agnès Benzonelli, some of you know her, is leading now on doing trace element analysis. We are finding a range of gold sources used for Muisca artifacts, some of which we still need to verify. So don't quote me on this, but it seems tempting, that they come from as far as the coast. So not just from the nearest gold sources. Now, we know that the Muisca moved a lot. We know they exchanged a lot of materials, at least, in rereading the ethnohistorical evidence, and that these exchanges were not purely economic. They were, of course, building ties in exchanging materials, and they are constantly collecting material, then offering, then collecting, then exchanging, then offering it. And part of the, I mean, their economy is hugely ritualized. We cannot separate one from the other. And in fact, you know, when we started this project, we were hypothesizing. So we're basically trying to understand how did they, in practice, manage to sustain these complex, useless technologies without coercive authorities. And one of our hypotheses was that they diversified the supply of raw materials. So they don't rely on a single egg basket, if you like, in case this channel is disrupted. And the evidence appears to support our hypothesis, but then this doesn't mean that they were doing it for pragmatic economic reasons. Maybe it's just a result of their ritual behavior and mobility that they happened to obtain source from a variety of sources.
I'll take two.
First, thanks for this fascinating talk, and I'm wondering again if thinking about the collective action vis-a-vis the hierarchical structure, whether it has to be one and do it the other. And I'm referring, I guess, for example, in coastal Oaxaca in Mexico, we have what we call affluent commoners, where we see luxury goods like polychrome vessels in commoners' household. Yet this is nested within a hierarchical structure, which is not necessarily coercive in that sense. So again, is that a question of different structures operating with the one within the other, and how can we tell? Again, obviously, you also eliminated the evidence for hierarchy for a state. At the same time, again, is it one versus the other, or can we see different structures within operating simultaneously?
Yeah, of course, it's not a matter of either or, and I'm sure we will agree that there are different ways of organizing social structures and managing goods. All I'm trying to do, of course, today in a summary is to put the emphasis on the horizontal links as opposed to the vertical. But even within Colombia, we're studying different regions. Today, I talked about only one, precisely to try to find more nuance about how this materializes in practice in different societies. And of course, there's plenty of other archaeological and historical case studies that speak of just a more colorful array of social structures and value systems. And I should also say that some archaeologists in Colombia and elsewhere would disagree with me, and they still think, you know, they think that the evidence is for accumulation of wealth and progressive inequality. But one of the reasons why I like Colombia, one of the many reasons why I like working in Colombia, is that we have millennia of these transition. So rather than focusing on forever looking for the little by little emergence of inequality and never completed process that will lead to state formation, we should focus in on how do they manage to sustain this for millennia.
One very quick last question.
So this is all the material content. Do we have any, texture evidence for these people?
For the Muisca, we do, yes. This is the society that the Europeans encounter.
So do we have a clear understanding about their religious practice?
Well, we have a lot of texts, but like most texts about the discovery and civilization, if you like, of the Americas, have an obvious bias. And there's a lot of literature, but a book published this or last year by Karl Langebeck that argues very compellingly about how whatever, even, I refuse, I'm hesitant to call them chiefs because, again, it's a very loaded term. So anyone who had a managerial or leadership role among the Muisca, because they were perhaps leading on a ritual or because they were collecting offerings to then reoffer them, redistribute to the community, they would call them jefe or king. So they turned them into little kings. They then argue that they are despotic because that's what then paves the way for them to say we need to remove them because we bring peace and civilization. And so you have to basically take European sources with a pinch of salt, which is what now the revisionist history is doing.
I hope you join me once again, thanking